The Bible relates how Jesus had many followers, and, unusually for the time, these included women. One of them was Mary Magdalene, said to have been at the foot of the cross when Jesus was crucified. The New Testament implies that she once anointed Jesus and washed his feet with precious oil, and that she was the first person to see the risen Christ. The controversy begins in 1997 with the publication of the Templar Revelation by authors Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince. They drew attention to Leonardo da Vinci's painting of the Last Supper, which appears to show Jesus seated next to a woman, a representation, the authors suggest, of Mary Magdalene. Lynn and Clive's work, Dan Brown himself freely admits, helped inspire the Da Vinci Code of 2003. In Dan Brown's novel, Jesus and Mary were married, had a child whose descendant still survives today. But that's the fiction. The historical question is, did Leonardo's painting really depict Mary Magdalene at the Last Supper? The Last Supper was the final meal that Jesus shared with his disciples shortly before he was crucified. In St. John's Gospel of the New Testament, chapter 13, verse 23, we read, "Now there was, leaning on Jesus' bosom, one of his disciples whom Jesus loved." As this same Gospel elsewhere seems to refer to John the Apostle as the disciple whom Jesus loved, it is generally assumed that the unnamed person who was leaning on Jesus' bosom during the Last Supper was St. John. Dan Brown and others disagree. It is argued that the apparent intimacy shared by Jesus and his companion, implied by this verse, suggests that the mysterious disciple was none other than Jesus' lover, Mary Magdalene. Most biblical scholars totally reject the idea. There is nothing in the Bible, they say, to imply that Jesus had an intimate relationship with Mary Magdalene, or married her, let alone sired children. Be that as it may, regardless of whatever relationship they shared, is there anything in the Bible to suggest that Mary Magdalene was the beloved disciple at the Last Supper? Perhaps. In St. John's Gospel, chapter 20, verse 2, this is the same Gospel that refers to the incident at the Last Supper, Mary Magdalene, having returned from Christ's empty tomb, addresses an unnamed person described as the other disciple whom Jesus loved. If the person being referred to here is John, as biblical scholars believe, then the verse could easily be interpreted to imply that Mary was also a disciple whom Jesus specifically loved, whatever that might mean. So Leonardo, or anyone else, might well have inferred that John or Mary was the beloved disciple at the Last Supper. But would Mary have been referred to as a disciple? Very probably. The word disciple is often confused with apostle. The apostles were the 12 men Jesus chose as his inner circle, such as Peter, Thomas, and of course St. John. Disciple referred not only to the 12 apostles, but to other followers of Jesus, male or female. The Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, for example, refers to 70 people described as disciples. None of this proves that Mary Magdalene was the beloved disciple at the Last Supper, but there is a case to be made, and one that may have persuaded Leonardo da Vinci to include her in his painting. But what about Mary Magdalene and her chalice? The Gospel of Mark tells us that after the crucifixion, Mary Magdalene and other women visited Jesus' tomb to anoint his body with spices, as was the Jewish tradition. But when they got there, they found the tomb empty, and Mary Magdalene was the first person to see the risen Christ. The vessel that Mary is said to have used to contain these spices came to be regarded as a sacred relic, almost equal to the Holy Grail. The reason being that early Christian tradition held that she used it to collect a few drops of Jesus' blood when he appeared to her at the tomb. In fact, in my book, The Chalice of Magdalene, I argued that this item may actually have inspired the Grail legend. According to John's Gospel, during Christ's ministry, a woman named Mary anointed Jesus with spikenard, a precious oil, and washed his feet. Early Christian tradition held that this Mary was Mary Magdalene, and that the vessel which held the oil was the same one she took to the tomb to anoint Jesus' body. In English translations of the New Testament, the other three Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke, tell us that the vessel was an alabaster box or jar. In the original Greek, the language in which the oldest Gospels were written, the word used is alabastron, a small type of pottery vessel for holding oil, especially perfume and scent, which is, incidentally, exactly what the Hawkstone cup happens to be, a scent jar made from green alabaster. Mary Magdalene became known as the woman with the alabaster jar, and from the Middle Ages onwards, artists invariably portrayed her holding the sacred relic. Depictions of the vessel became ever more elaborate. Often it was portrayed as a golden chalice, hence the Chalice of Magdalene. It was this cup that the Peveril family of Whittington Castle in central Britain claimed to have possessed during the Middle Ages, and one of their descendants, the antiquarian Thomas Wright, said that he still possessed it during the 19th century. And before he died, having no heir to hand it on to, he hid it in a labyrinth of caves in these cliffs at Hawkstone Park in his native Shropshire. And he created an elaborate series of clues to lead to its location, which included this stained glass window that he designed and paid to have installed at nearby Hodnet Church. It shows the Gospel writers Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. And it was the John figure that held the final clue to reveal the cup's location. But it seems to me that this is a thinly disguised Mary Magdalene. It is generally assumed that John the Gospel writer was one and the same as John the Apostle, who leant on Jesus' bosom during the Last Supper. As we have seen, Leonardo da Vinci may have thought that the disciple in question was Mary Magdalene. Did Thomas Wright believe that too? The St. John figure certainly seems to be a woman. It even appears to have breasts. One objection to this is that if it was Mary Magdalene, she would be depicted with her head covered. The same argument that is used to challenge the notion that Leonardo painted Mary Magdalene at the Last Supper. It is certainly true that in 1st century Judea, Mary Magdalene would be expected to wear a headscarf. But since medieval times, artists almost always portrayed Mary without her head covered. It is also true that artists often painted St. John looking somewhat effeminate, and he is often shown with a chalice. This stems from an early Christian story that once St. John was given a cup of wine that had been poisoned, but the poison came out in the form of a serpent or snake, and John drank unharmed. When John is depicted with a cup, it has a snake or a serpent in it. But the chalice the figure is holding in the Hodnet window is empty. I believe that this was Thomas Wright's allusion to the popular portrayals of the Chalice of Magdalene. It has also been pointed out that the figure is wearing red and green, colours associated with St. John, such as this typical depiction of him in a stained glass window elsewhere. But Mary Magdalene is also often portrayed wearing red and green. Thomas Wright may well have concluded, like Leonardo before him perhaps, that Mary Magdalene was actually the disciple mistaken for John at the Last Supper. I am convinced that others certainly felt this way, centuries before the Da Vinci Code. Surely no one would say that this depiction of the beloved disciple by German artist Johann Zoffany in 1787 could be anything but a woman. One way or the other, this was the final clue that Thomas Wright left to lead to what he believed was the scent jar of Mary Magdalene. But Thomas Wright claimed to have possessed another sacred relic, an ancient scroll written by none other than Jesus himself. I doubt very much that that's true, but I'd love to find out. It's just possible that this scroll held in the John-Mary figure's other hand could lead to its whereabouts.